started. Welcome to the Office of Justice Programs or the Office of the Comptroller's monthly webinar sessions. This particular one is entitled Pass-Through Entities Oversight Responsibility for Subrecipients. So each month, as a result of the pandemic and not doing in-person trainings anymore, we decided to do monthly financial management topics that we felt that you were interested in. This one came up as a very popular one that you wanted to do based on the evaluations we do at the end of the session. Give an idea or some history behind this particular presentation. It came about as a result of an audit finding with the Office of Justice Programs. So just like you, if there's an audit finding against your program, we had to propose corrective action plans with the Office of Inspector General in order to get this particular finding resolved. The finding, however, was that it was believed that based on the review of the Office of Inspector General of OJP or Department of Justice grantees, they felt that the pass-through entities did not have the knowledge or the experience they need in order to adequately pass down funds to other non-federal entities and be able to manage them. So as a result, we proposed a corrective action plan. One was this particular presentation. So keep in mind that this audit finding was, and don't quote me on the actual time frame, was between 5 or 6 years ago. So as a result, I have updated these slides in order to reflect the recent OMB update guidance where it was applicable with this particular presentation. Also, the requirement was to train grantees on these pass-through responsibilities. So based on the overwhelming response that we received for this particular training, I believe I had to conduct 4 separate sessions because the first response we had well over 1,000, I think it was close to 2,000 recipients responded or showed an interest in this particular class. So we divided it where it came up with 4 different sessions. So that's a little history in reference to this particular training. So with that, let's go ahead and get started to give you an idea over the next hour or so, these things or these topics that I'll be covering. I want to start off with the definitions. I believe that getting a firm understanding or concept of this particular training here or this particular topic is to understand the definitions and how OMB has defined them and how they will work with you understanding this relationship of subrecipients, pass-through entities, as well as contractors. So again, we're going to start off with definitions. From there, I want to move into the determination, or how do you determine a subrecipient as opposed to a contractor. OMB created some characteristics that I'll share with you on some things that you can look at to determine on what side of the fence, and I'll use that term, this particular entity will fall. Will they be a subrecipient and or will they be a contractor? Then overall the responsibilities, because now this is the key factor that OMB addressed in the finding, is that the pass-through entity had to know their responsibilities for subrecipients. From there, we'll move into the requirements for pass-through entities, and I'll break it up into the pre-award requirements and then follow it with the post-award requirements. Then I'll share with you some of the findings or some of the issues that the OIG had in their findings and which led to this particular training and the Office of Justice Programs having to resolve those particular findings. Always want to leave you with some resources where you can go to get additional information, if not on this particular topic, as well as other topics. Then we'll talk about the contact information or my information. If you ever have any questions about this slide presentations, you can always feel free to reach out to me, and I'll try my best to answer any questions that you may have that I don't address in this particular session. So with that, let's start off, like I said, with those definitions. So when I'm thinking about or looking at the definitions that I want you to be able to grasp, is based on the uniform guidance. They define what a pass-through entity is. So a pass-through entity is a non-federal entity that provides a subaward to a subrecipient. And here's what I really want you to focus on, because I'll be using this term throughout this whole presentation, and that is to carry out part of the federal program. So again, if I want you to be able to determine that based on the money that's being passed through to another entity, are they or is that entity carrying out a part of that particular federal grant program? So the definition for this can be found in the Uniform Guidance, 2 CFR 200.1. Next, what is a subaward? So a subaward is an award that's provided by the pass-through entity to the subrecipient. And again, for that subrecipient to carry out a part of that federal grant program. Key, are they working on a part of that federal grant program which was required by the pass-through entity? Now, want to make sure that this is clear, because sometimes money is passed down to another entity and or organization that does not fit the billet for a subaward. So I want you to note that subaward does not include the payments to a contractor, because when we're talking about a contractor now, we're talking about that procurement relationship, or to an individual that is a beneficiary of a federal grant program or federal program. And here's what I mean by that. To give you an example, there's a program that provides funds being passed down from the federal agency to that individual of a fallen police officer, okay? So these funds will go to the spouse of that fallen police officer. So again, although funds are being passed through or passed down to a lower level, if we're talking about a procurement nature, then that's not a subaward, or an individual, as I said here, that is a beneficiary of a program. Let's define a subrecipient. So a subrecipient is a non-federal entity that receives this subaward from the pass-through entity, again, being passed down, and again, to carry out part of that federal award program. OJP has various types of programs where the design of these programs is to pass those federal funds down to another entity. There are some programs within OJP that requires maybe 90% or 75% or maybe even 2/3 of those funds are required to be passed down to other entities. And the concept behind that is that based on the pass-through, the work is being done at a lower level. So the design of this program or these programs is to make sure that the entities that are actually doing the work have the opportunity to receive those funds. So the statutes will require that those funds be passed down. So again, they are now carrying out an aspect of that federal grant program. So what is a contract? Let's say a contract is a legal instrument by which a non-federal entity purchases property or services needed to carry out an aspect of a particular grant program. And again, even though it has the term carry out the project or program under a federal grant program, to give you an example, because sometimes I get torn between that same phrase being used also in contracts. But again, to give you an idea, when we're talking about a contract or this procurement relationship, let's talk about property. So let's say that equipment is needed in order to implement this particular grant program, some equipment that comes to mind is that there may be a database that needs to be implemented so that other jurisdictions, based on the information that's put into this database, can share that information. So again, based on that and depending on the language of the solicitation, in most cases, I would look at this to be a contract or a procurement nature as opposed to a subrecipient nature. Now, the terms as used in this part does not include a legal instrument, okay, based on this definition, even if the non-federal entity considers it a contract. Now, don't get me wrong, even when we're talking about a subaward, there is a form of a contract or agreement that is being made, but here it's different. So even though the pass-through entity may look at this to be a contract, what we're going to do is look at the substance or the nature of that agreement to determine whether or not this is truly a contract or a procurement type of relationship. And then what is a contractor? A contractor is the organization or entity that receives those funds based on the definition of the previous slide. So now let's get into the subrecipient versus contractor determination. This determination is something that is the pass-through's responsibility. Keep in mind that the federal awarding agency may provide some type of guidance to assist you in making that determination, but I want you to understand that making this determination based on the uniform guidance is the pass-through entity's responsibility. So with that, making this determination as to whether or not we're talking about a subrecipient or a contractor, I need you to know that it's not always straightforward, because sometimes there are things about the relationship that lends itself to determine that we are truly talking about a subrecipient or subaward relationship. And then based on, like I was talking about with contracts, and we're talking about buying property, lends itself to be a procurement nature. The uniform guidance says that there is no one factor that you can use to determine or to determine one type of entity from the other. Okay, and I do agree with that, but I do find that if I look at one of the factors and rely heavily on that particular factor, then it's a good chance that we are talking about a subrecipient relationship. And then if I look at that and I home in on that and I'm convinced that that's it, the other factors above that will come into play. And I'll show you what I mean by that once we get to the chart in reference to that. So in fact, you must keep in mind that when you're doing this determination, the entity that you're doing this performance or this check for may possess characteristics on both sides of the spectrum. So not in all cases can we say that because I have 3 on this side and 2 on this side, then it's actually the one that has the most. In most cases, I want to say that that is true. But again, I'll give you some pointers on looking at this to determine whether or not the right determination has been made, and you can be comfortable with that. The uniform guidance also says that the form of the agreement they believe is less important, and I agree with that, than the actual work that's being performed, and they call it the substance of the agreement. With the substance, we are looking at the characteristics that would lend this particular entity to be a subrecipient, because this entity, again, as I said, is implementing an aspect of that particular grant program. So when I think of form, I'm thinking about the legal agreement, so whether or not we're talking about a memorandum of understanding, contract. And I hate to say this, in some cases where we went out and looked at an organization where the form of the agreement was a handshake because the entity could not provide any supporting documentation in reference to the agreement, and we did advise that they did put that in writing. But again, I'm less concerned about the form. You know, I'm looking at what is being done to properly classify or to help classify whether or not we're talking about a subrecipient and or contractor. Most important, an organization may label a organization as a subrecipient and or contractor, but keep in mind that doesn't dictate how the awarding agency or DOJ will look at that relationship in reference to grant administrative purposes. So again, to get an idea of this relationship and how to make that determination, please refer to 2 CFR Part 200.331, which is the determination section of the Uniform Guidance. So here's what I was talking about earlier in reference to the form that the OMB created in reference to give you an idea of things to look for to determine whether or not we're talking about a subrecipient versus a contractor. So these are the characteristics that you would want to look for when we're talking about this determination. I mentioned earlier that there is one sense that I look at to determine whether or not we're talking about a subrecipient is the fifth one. Okay, so it says, in accordance with this agreement, uses the federal funds to carry out a part of that particular program. So again, remember I said I'm going to be using this term throughout this presentation because that's what I'm looking for. If the entity is implementing an aspect of that particular grant program that was authorized in the statute and was a part of the language in the solicitation and is which the grantee applied for those fundings, then I can say that for the most part, then now we're talking about a subrecipient, okay? The one over top of that, so we're really truly talking about those funds being passed to a subrecipient, then naturally, the one above it is responsible for adhering to the applicable program requirements and even the reporting requirements, okay? So all of those will come into play if we're really talking about a subrecipient. Moving to the other side of contractors, the thing that I want to stress here to make sure that you take into consideration is three parts here, or three lines here that I want to say trip up some entities to misclassify a subrecipient as a contractor. So I'm referring to the language in 1, 2, and 4. It says provides goods and services. When I went out and looked at various types of agreements with the pass-through entity and I'll use this term, subrecipient, is that the pass-through entity had misclassified the entity as a contractor because they focused on the word services here. So I'll give you an idea of what I mean by that. Based on a particular grant program, let's just say that this grant program is designed, based on the statutes and the solicitation, is designed to do three things. And let's say that those things are job placement, job training, and mentorship, okay? And based on this particular program, it is designed or focused on a particular, let's say, youth age range, whether we're talking about male or female. But the idea behind this program is to reduce these individuals from joining gangs, giving them another alternative to joining gangs. So the program believes that if we can provide training, job placement, and mentorship, we can reduce the amount of youth that end up with gangs. So you apply for this particular federal grant program, and based on your agency, you're able to accommodate two of the requirements. You can do the job placement and the training. but your organization lacks the expertise in order to do the mentoring piece of this particular grant program. So you reach outside of your organization, bring in an entity that's going to do the mentoring aspect of this particular grant. So even though we're talking about them performing a service for this particular grant program, it is carrying out, number 5 on the other side, an aspect of that particular grant program, which makes them now a subrecipient and not a contractor, even though that they are providing service. So the most important thing that I want to stress on this side of the chart is don't get hung up on the term service and just automatically think that we're talking about a contractor. Look at the entire substance that OMB talks about, what is actually being done in order to determine whether or not we're talking about a true subrecipient versus a contractor. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty of this, the pass-through entity's responsibility or your responsibilities for subrecipients. This information can be found in the Uniform Guidance in 200.332. The most important thing that you want to be mindful of when we're talking about subrecipients is that you want to make sure that they are implementing that grant program in accordance to the program guidelines, okay? Give you some ideas and how to make sure that you're doing that to help, I want to use this term, to help reduce the amount of errors or things that may go wrong down at the subrecipient level. I'm saying here that you're overseeing the day-to-day operations at the subrecipient level. Now, a lot of people get the wrinkles in the forehead when I say this, but I am not saying that you have to set up a desk down at the subrecipient level and monitor or micromanage everything that goes on down at the subrecipient level. I'm putting this in here because I want to stress the importance that if things do go wrong down at the subrecipient level, as a pass-through entity, it is your responsibility to resolve whatever those issues are and get the grantee or the subrecipient back on track, implementing that particular grant program according to those guidelines, okay? Your responsibility is to ensure that the subrecipient provides you the information you need in a timely manner. So whether we're talking about financial or programmatic reports, you want to make sure that this is clear in the documentation that you give to the subrecipients on timelines in order to get certain things to your organization. And I'll go a step further that in some cases, depending on the conditions that you place in the sub-award, even letting them know up front the repercussions or penalties that possibly could happen if they're not abiding by those rules and regulations. Again, as the subrecipient, as the pass-through entity, it is your responsibility to take timely actions to get the subrecipient back on track, okay? Sometimes it's done by a mistake. Sometimes it's done because they do not have the knowledge, financial knowledge, to implement these particular grant programs. So that's why, and I'll get into this later, that's why sometimes you want to pay close attention to the risk assessment that you perform when you're looking at subrecipients and which one needs, I hate to put it this way, but needs more hand-holding than other entities. The most important thing to remember here is the use of a subrecipient does not relieve the pass-through entity of their responsibility. Remember earlier I talked about based on various types of programs, it is a requirement of that particular grant program to pass down possibly all of the grant funds to a lower tier organization that's doing the work. And I use the term all because maybe 90% is going down, and with just about all grant programs, there's always an amount left for oversight or to manage these particular grant programs at admin funds. So again, if 90% is going down to where the work is being done, and you as a pass-through entity is not doing any work outside of oversight, that still does not relieve you of your responsibilities for a particular grant program. To give you an idea of something that happened where this was the case, where an organization passed down all of the funds, in this case, all of the funds, to another organization, and they felt that they had no more responsibility because everything was with what they considered, or what we considered, the subrecipient. There was an organization that came into DOJ and applied for federal funds, but they were not eligible to receive these funds based on the type of entity that applied for these funds. Now, what they did is went to another organization that was eligible for these particular funds, okay, and explained to them that they could apply for these funds and get these particular funds. So the organization said, well, look, we don't have the manpower to do this, and this is something right now that we just can't, tackle at this time. So the organization said, well, look, don't even worry about that. If you apply for the funds, get the funds, you can transfer all of the funds to us. You don't have to worry about anything. We'll do all of the work for you. So the organization felt that it was a good idea because the services that this grant program was providing was something that was needed in their area. So they did. They applied for the funds, got the funds, transferred all of the funds, or let me put it like this: they transferred everything to the subrecipient. Okay, and when I say everything, they passed everything. The passcodes to get into OGP system, the password to do the drawdowns from the system. I mean, they passed everything to the subrecipient because, again, remember, they said they would do everything on this particular grant program. So as a result, I want to say a year later, maybe a year and a half later, that entity that applied for the federal funds came up on our monitoring list. So when we did the reach out to the organization saying that, hey, we want to come out and look and see how things are operating with this particular program, because of the amount of time, I want to say because of the amount of time that had elapsed since they had actually applied for it, initially they had no clue as to what it is that we were referring to. So it took a minute for them to come up on board and realize what it was that we were talking about. So they explained to us that they had transferred everything over to the other organization that said that they would be responsible for it. So when we came out and looked at the organization, we had to tell them that based on what this slide is saying, transferring it to the subrecipient will not relieve you of your responsibilities for this particular award. So had to work with that particular organization to get all of those things back to that organization that was eligible for the grant program, and not leave anything down at the idea was not to leave anything down at the subrecipient level, but based on the program, I believe we may have had to leave something. So what we did is in the financial guide, we had to put in language that if you're not eligible for a direct award through DOJ, then you can't be a sole source vendor or whatever for that particular award. So that was how we were able to resolve that particular finding. So now when I think about the pass-through responsibilities, let's start off with pre-award. So when I'm looking at pre-award, the pass-through entity must have established policy and procedures on how they're going to manage that particular subaward. So when I'm talking about manage that subaward, I'm talking about its entire life cycle of that award. You want to make sure that it is clearly understood as to who has the responsibility, how it's going to be managed, and things that you're going to look at throughout the life of that particular award. So again, policy and procedures, strong policy and procedures will help you get this done. So if you don't have subrecipient monitoring or management policies and procedures, you want to make sure that you create those as soon as possible. The pass-through entity must decide on the appropriate instrument. Remember what I said about the determination, whether we're talking about a subrecipient or a contractor. What is that process? A starting point would be the characteristics chart that the OMB has created, but based on your understanding of this, you may add additional line items to it to home you in on whether or not we're talking about a true subaward and or contractor. You also must have a method to announce that you have funding available for eligible recipients. Okay, so the last thing that you want is any protest because you didn't announce the federal funds that were available for eligible recipients. And again, you must have a process for reviewing each subrecipient's eligibility, okay? Knowing what qualifies an organization to be eligible for these particular grant programs, you must know that, and your subrecipients must know that, because you don't want somebody applying or organization applying for funds that are not eligible because we didn't let them know up front what those particular criteria were. So again, you must ensure that recipients are not suspended or debarred. And even though on this bullet I have subrecipients, that's still applicable for contractors as well. So whenever we're passing money down from one level to the next, we must make sure that that entity is not on the suspension and debarment list, okay? When I think about the suspension and debarment list, most organizations do good with looking to make sure that they're not on the suspension and debarment list, but have no follow-up plan to check 6 months or maybe a year down the road to ensure that that organization still isn't on it. Well, let me say this. The uniform guidance does not require an organization to go back in and look. Okay, I'm just suggesting this because I've received multiple calls where an organization said that this business can't be found, they're no longer available, they filed for bankruptcy, whatever the case is. How do I get the federal funds back? Okay, and I found out that yes, they did check the suspension and debarment list prior to making the award, but they had no follow-up plans to make sure that this organization didn't later fall on the suspension and debarment list. This one organization, I believe that this organization was in the process of being suspended and debarred, because when we looked at the date that this organization was suspended and debarred, it happened to be just a few months after they made that subaward. Again, you want to have clearly identified in the announcement all of the things that are applicable to that particular grant program, the terms and conditions of that particular award. Now, when I talk about terms and conditions here, your organization may be able to add additional terms and conditions outside of the ones that we place in the actual award document. You can be more restrictive with your subrecipients than we are with you. But here's the thing that you want to keep in mind. You cannot hinder the subrecipient from completing the goals and objectives of the grant program based on those additional requirements. I'll give you an example of an additional requirement that was placed on the subrecipient in reference to the 10% rule. 10% rule says that a grantee can move up to 10% between approved budget categories without prior approval. However, the pass-through entity placed a more restrictive requirement saying that they could only move 5% without prior approval. So I received a telephone call from an organization who asked me to explain to them the 10% rule. Now, that was an answer that I could give them right away. I didn't have to say, well, let me research it and call you back. So when I explained the 10% rule, the person on the other end said, I thought that was the requirement, but the state said I can only move 5%. When the person on the other line said the state said, I knew I was talking to a subrecipient, I started scratching my head because now I'm wondering, how did a subrecipient get my telephone number? Okay, so what I did is I asked a few questions, and the answer to these questions allowed me to explain to them that I was not in a position to help them, and the the pass-through entity was within their rights. So I asked, was that language in the terms and conditions of the award? So the individual on the other line said yes. So I said, well, did you sign the award agreeing to that? And they told me yes. So based on the answer to those two questions, there was nothing that I could do. So again, be mindful of, and I'm saying this for this reason, because a lot of you that deal with subrecipients know some of the things that you'll jump through hoops with them about. So if you address it up front in the terms and conditions of the award, okay, supplemental requirements, hopefully that'll put you in a better position to get less resistance or pushback from the subrecipient. You want to make sure that you include specific elements about the grant program. Let them know the type of grant. I'm still using this, its unique identifier, which used to be the CDF number. I'll get it in a minute. But that's the number that they need in order to give to their auditor in order to identify that particular grant program. So again, you want to make sure that they have all of the information that they need in order to know that particular grant program. So the pass-through entity, and I'll put it this way, and I use the term here, highly recommended, should perform a risk assessment at the application phase. There's nothing in the uniform guidance that requires this. I'm just highly recommending that because remember what I talked about, the suspension and debarment. There are some other red flags that an organization can find out if they do this additional step up front prior to passing grant funds. Now, again, they may be still eligible and you may still want to make the awards to them, but now based on this additional information that you have, you may be now prone to put those supplemental requirements on there that I talked about earlier. So when you're evaluating the risk of a particular entity or agency, certain things that you may be looking for is that the applicant's eligibility or whether or not they qualify for the program. Are they financially stable? Okay, is there anything that you've been able to find out that this organization isn't financially stable? This is an organization, if you give them funds and something goes wrong, you go looking for them 6-8 months down the road and they're no longer there. Again, the quality of their financial management system, okay? Whether or not you can find any history of performance, and a good thing to look at is audit findings, okay? When you're looking at audit findings, and I'll say this way, when you're looking at audit findings, you always want to be looking at audit findings that, I use the term, that are cross-cutting issues, okay? So give an example. If you look at an audit report and it talks about the grantee's ability to do something on an HHS grant, a Health and Human Service grant program, that finding is specific to that particular organization. So it wouldn't be a cross-cutting issue. But if the issue is that they lack certain types of control in their management system, see, that's not only an issue for HHS, it's also an issue for DOJ, okay? So those are the type of issues that you might want to look at to make sure that it's not something that you have to address up front, okay? The result of the risk assessment, again, can assist you in determining whether or not I need to add additional conditions on this particular award, or how soon I might need to go do my first site visit with this particular organization. So now let's look at the pass-through entity's responsibility for post-award requirement and risk assessment, okay? So when I talk about risk assessment for post-award, it is now the requirement, okay? So the uniform guidance does require the pass-through entity to do a risk assessment of each subrecipient for their non-compliance or their ability to not be in compliance with the federal statutes, rules, or regulations of that particular grant program. Again, to determine the appropriate level of monitoring that's going to be needed for that particular organization. Even though I'm talking financial here from you, because this is financial, programmatic requirements also need to be taken into consideration. Their ability to implement these particular grant programs. Do they have all that they need in their possession in order to do the programmatic piece of this particular grant program? When you're doing these risk assessment, there's a number of different attributes that you can use to assist you in determining risk. Based on the risk, you should come up with some type of scoring mechanism that would place an organization in either a low, medium, or high risk scoring. A pass-through entity should develop a method to determine the level of risk that they need to assign to each subrecipient. This is just a sample that I created to give you an idea, because you can use numbers, alphabets, or whatever it is you want to use in order to determine the risk factor. Here I use numbers, and I kept it simple, 1, 2, 3. And I came up with only 3 criteria, and I give you the reason why I placed them where I did. So confidential funds or petty cash. Whenever we're talking about confidential funds or grantees' ability to create or have a petty cash account on site, I believe that that raises the risk of fraud and or theft with those particular funds. So again, I gave it a 3, or I'm considering it a high risk. Subawards amount of less than $25,000, I have it 1, or a low risk. You need to understand why my thinking for this, or why I put it that way. This organization that normally makes subawards in excess of $400,000. Okay, so all of their awards that are generally made are in excess of $400,000. So when I get a subaward that's less than $25,000, I believe the risk associated with that is low or very low. Delinquent reports, multiple reports, moves you from low to high risk or medium. So again, if a grantee falls in the 2 or medium range, we want to start looking at them to determine what's going on, how we can help in order to move them from 2 back to 1, because we don't want them to go over to 3. The overall level of risk identified should support the frequency of monitoring that you do with this particular organization. When I think about the population of subrecipients that you have, all of them should be placed in that population to determine whether or not they need to be monitored, okay? And I don't want to say, well, I will say whether or not they need to be monitoring, because monitoring will determine based on the number of subrecipients that you have. But the key that I want to explain is that this is an annual process that needs to be done of the entire population. Why I'm using the term entire population? Because this year I may be adding new subrecipients. Next year they may fall off and new ones add. So you always want to make sure that you have the most current information when you're doing this risk assessment. Some additional things that you may want to look at. I broke them up into a couple of categories. General assessment. The award amount is always important, because I always believe the higher the award amount, the more likely things could go awry. Whether or not we're talking about a new subrecipient, if we have no dealings with this organization, we may want to watch them closely until we develop that relationship with them. The suspension and debarment. This is something that you legally, that you always want to make sure that you do. And again, I suggest that at some point you go back in and revisit them to make sure that they're still not on the suspension and debarment list. And whether or not the organization has any federal debt that they owe. Because if there's federal debt that they owe from one organization, the likelihood of those funds going to pay off that federal debt is very likely. And then financial, again, I talked about delinquent reports and audits. You know, look at the audit opinion and their ability to get those opinions resolved. The assessment of these attributes should provide you, again, the basis in order to develop that monitoring plan and the strategy that you will implement moving forward to make sure that you're looking at those organizations that may put you in a high risk of them not complying with the federal grant program. Again, while this process is not all inclusive, it does give you a starting point in order to look at risk and develop that monitoring plan. Again, let's talk about post-awards, but subrecipient monitoring. So the pass-through entity, again, must create an annual plan. Remember, I just talked about that. You must do an annual plan because there are some organizations that won't receive funding this year or their particular grants are closed, so you want to make sure that you're doing this annually. Again, subrecipients should fall in this range of risk. So we were talking about low, medium, or high. The idea is, and you're looking at all, because our grantees that are low risk, we don't want them moving to medium. And the grantees that are medium, we want to move them to low because we don't want them to move to high. And the same thing is applicable to high. We need to get them off of the high risk, get them to medium, and ultimately to low. According to the uniform guidance, there is no specific method of doing monitoring, okay? So currently, our organization does two types. So we're either going on site, looking at the organization, and I am going to say that that's the best, okay? Because on site, I can review the operations and I can see how things operate. In-house is another tool, so don't get me wrong, it's something to do and something that we utilize because we, probably just like you, cannot go and look at all of the grantees that we would like to. I think the only thing about in-house is you have to rely on their management system, on the supporting documentation that you're actually receiving. And then if it's not what you really believe to be fair, okay, then you can ask for additional information, or then we want to do a site visit to go on the actual site. So the effectiveness of the monitoring plan may also result in identifying potential training that the subrecipient needs. So again, you have the ability to make sure that they take training or get training that they need to bring them up to speed. So again, the pass-through entity should develop a monitoring objectives to ensure that subrecipients, one, carry out the program activities as stipulated in the application that they submitted to you. Have adequate internal controls, and I can't stress the importance of their internal controls. Keep in mind, the same thing that we do, based on the size of an organization, you may not have the level of internal controls that you'd like. But again, you want to make sure that based on looking at these internal controls and the size of that organization, no one individual is handling any process from start to finish. Claim reimbursement for costs that are allowable, reasonable, necessary under that particular grant program. I'm going to say this, and a lot of times I get the wrinkles in the forehead when I say this. When we're talking about reimbursement for grantees, In some cases, and I do know some state agencies that do this, based on the size of an organization, they have allowed a subrecipient to get an advance. Okay, I know you wow, an advance. The deal is if you are going to allow a subrecipient to get an advance because they may not have the working capital in order to hold themselves, if you're only paying them monthly or quarterly, okay, it has to be under the same guidelines that we allow you. So I allow you, or we allow you, to do an advance for up to 10 days. So if you're going to exercise that with your subrecipients, you have to follow that 10-day grace period too. Make sure that there's no conflict of interest that exists at the organization, and always maintain or require that they maintain the supporting documentation to justify all the costs that have been billed against that particular grant program. So I want to real quickly just run through some things to give you an idea of things that we do when we're preparing for an on-site visit. Some of the characteristics are the same with a desk review, but it's just a little bit more detailed, or more things that we do with a site visit. So again, before going out, we'll look at the subrecipients, or before you go out, you want to look at the subrecipient's application, what it was that they applied for, the written agreement that you had with the subrecipient. You want to look at their financial and progress reports, because prior to going out, some of these reports may clue you into some things that you might need to address when you're going out there. Drawdown history. Have they drawn down more funds than the level of work that they perform, or vice versa? That might be a discussion that you need to have when you get there. And again, a copy of those audit reports. I'm always going to stress those cross-cutting audit issues. And again, the results of the review may inform you of potential problems prior to going out that you want to get addressed when you're on site. Some best practices that you may want to incorporate, or some things that we use, are you want to make sure that you always notify the subrecipient, have that entrance conference, look at that supporting documentation, exit conference, follow up if needed, corrective action plan, and then close it out. So based on that, I'll go real quickly through each. So notification, you want to send out a formal notice letting the subrecipient know that you're coming out to look at their particular grant program. It shouldn't be a shock as to you when you're coming out, and the type of information that you want to make sure that they have available for you in order to look at. And then you want to make sure that they know those key people that need to be a part of this particular visit when you come out. The entrance conference, again, you want to hold it on site with the appropriate people that needs to be there, any financial or programmatic people. And then again, you're just reinforcing why you're there, so that they're clear as to why you're there, and possibly how long you're going to be there, and the type of information that you're going to need access to. Based on that, the documentation, you want to make sure that you go with the financial person to gather this information. Some of the information that you may look at or be looking at, you may need them to walk you through it, because it may not be clear on their process of doing this stuff. So it's perfectly acceptable to ask them to walk you through the steps. And I'll give you an idea. Based on indirect costs, you may want to ask them what is their process for applying the indirect cost to those indirect cost items, and to ensure that no indirect cost is applied to any unallowable cost. For exit conference. So once you've done everything and looked at everything, then you want to meet with those folks that need to be there and explain what you looked at, what you found, what was actually resolved while you were on site, and then what needs to be still addressed by the particular organization. Again, for any deficiencies that's not resolved by the end of the exit conference, they need to have a clear understanding as to what it is they need to do in order to get that resolved. Then a follow-up letter. You want to make sure in the follow-up letter that you're recognizing what they did well and those things that they need to address in order to get these recommendations closed. They need to know upfront the deadline. Okay, give them a specific time in order to get this information to you. And then again, you want to make sure that you develop the follow-up letter using what I'm going to call standard language. You want to make sure it's clear to them the road moving forward, what it is that they actually need to do in order to get that resolved. Then the corrective action plan. So you're requesting this corrective action plan, and again, to address any deficiencies that were not resolved while you were on site. Again, a specific time frame in order to get this information to you in order to be able to close it. And again, once you're satisfied with everything, that site visit can be closed, and you want to send them documentation letting them know that everything has been addressed. So remedies for subrecipients noncompliance. One of the most, I'm not going to say the most, but one of the most effective ways to address noncompliance is to, I'll use this term, anticipate. And I want to say anticipate because with you working with subrecipients, some of the things that you've seen, you've already known or know what particular subrecipient will do certain types of pushbacks or that you're going to have problems with. So you want to make sure that in that agreement, in those terms and conditions of that award, you put those things in there because you want them to know up front, this is what you need to do in order to implement this grant program. If not, then there are going to be some repercussions for that. So again, when you're looking at things for noncompliance, if you look at the Uniform Guidance 200.339, it gives you an idea of how to address subrecipients that don't comply with the federal guidelines of a federal grant program. So if noncompliance cannot be remedied by opposing additional terms and conditions, you always want to start off with adding additional conditions. You know, if you don't do this, we're going to do that, okay? So if that seems not to work, then you can temporarily withhold funds, disallow part or all of the cost. In most cases, if we have an issue with an invoice with one or two items on there, you may not want to hold up the entire invoice. You can pay them for those costs that are allowable. Deal with wholly or partly suspending or terminating the sub-award. Initiate the suspension or debarment. Hold future funds, and depending on what's actually going on, there may be legal remedies that you can also institute on that particular organization. So closeout requirements. When I think of closeout requirements, you want to make sure that the pass-through entity is giving you everything that you need within a timely manner so that you can close out the particular grant. One of the things that I like about the updated uniform guidance, OMB was actually very specific about the requirements for closing out subawards. So they're saying that the pass-through entity must receive all of the financial and programmatic information from the pass-through entity within 90 days. So that gives you, what, an additional 30 days, 120, in order to do everything that you need to do to close out that particular grant program in order to get it done in a timely manner. So again, when it was 90 days to close out federal grant programs, OMB was silent on the time frame for subrecipients. So I do appreciate that with this update, they were very specific about this information for subrecipients. In paying subrecipients, you want to make sure that you're following the prompt pay requirements for subrecipients. That information on how to pay subrecipients is also a part of the uniform guidance in 344C, okay? And then also for the closeout process to address refunds of any cash that's owed back to your organization, that information on how that's supposed to be handled is also in the uniform guidance and under 2 CFR 200.344 D and F. So again, I wanted to share with you some of the findings from the Office of Inspector General that led to this presentation. The finding that we had to address with the OIG was that they didn't see where the pass-through entity established those policy and procedures on how subawards were supposed to be made and managed. So I talked about the importance of creating those policy and procedures, those strong policy and procedures to ensure that you know how subawards will be made, any announcements that needs to go out, the time frame for that, and how it's going to be managed throughout the life of that particular subaward. They said that they didn't see where pass-through entities ensured that subrecipient monitoring procedures were adequate or implemented effectively, okay? So again, it's good to have policy and procedures, but if you don't implement them or if they're not followed, then what good are they? They also said that adequately monitoring subrecipients to provide reasonable assurance that they were complying with the terms and conditions of award. So again, pass-through entities were not making sure that the subrecipients were conforming to the terms and conditions of the award. Also, they found that the pass-through entities were not ensuring that resources are available in order to provide adequate monitoring. So again, one of the reasons that the OIG identified is that the pass-through entity were saying that they didn't have funds in order to go out and do adequate monitoring. So again, when we're applying for these federal funds, funds should be allotted within that grant program in order for you to do monitoring, okay? And I'm using the term monitoring, so I'm not saying that it has to be site visit, which again is to me the best or the most effective way, but some form of monitoring. So because we don't have funds to go out doesn't mean that we still shouldn't be doing some type of monitoring. Again, they found that they were not providing adequate training or technical assistance to their staff in order to look at these particular grant programs to determine whether or not they were in compliance. And again, they weren't establishing procedures to ensure that subrecipients complied with the single audit requirements. One of the issues here was that the subrecipient was under the impression that when federal funds was passed down to them from the state, they weren't federal funds, but they were state funds. So it's important that the subrecipient know the source of these funds and being passed down to them. And then naturally they noted that they were not reporting in FAFATA. Again, remember what I talked about misclassifying a contractor, a subrecipient as a contractor. So if that misclassification occurred, then naturally they weren't doing the FAFATA reporting requirements. So with that, I wanted to share with you some resources that you may want to look at. Uniform guidance, again, we're following the uniform guidance. It was updated November 12, 2020. So this presentation does incorporate those. The DOJ financial guide, it was updated this year in March. And again, remember I told you I'm big on internal controls. So here are two documents that you may want to look at in reference to internal control. One we call the Green Book, and the other one is COSO. So again, I'm not saying that you don't have adequate policy and procedures in place for internal controls, but this may allow you to enhance what you already have. Want to talk about subawards under OJP awards and procurement contracts, okay? So OJP, again, has some information online that you can look at that they call a toolkit to give you some ideas along with the chart that I shared from OMB to help you make that proper determination as to whether or not we're talking about a subrecipient and or contract or procurement. Some common federal administrative requirements that apply to all for subawards of OJP grant programs. This link at the bottom can help you with that. And then again, there's some other OJP resources on related topics that can also help. Non-procurement, and I'll just talk about this real quickly. When we're talking about non-competitive procurement, again, we're talking about making an award, a contract to an organization in excess of the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000. Now, again, you can do sole source. Hopefully, your procurement procedures addressed your ability to do sole source at a certain threshold, but again, based on federal grant programs, that threshold is anything over $250,000. You need to reach out to the funding source and provide justification as to why you're going sole source in that amount. So for additional information, please refer to the information that we have online. Sole source fact sheet could help you with some of the questions that you may have. And then again, contact information. If there's anything about this particular presentation that you feel that you might need some additional explanation on, my telephone number and email address. I always want to leave you with the customer service because there may be other things that you may need assistance with, so this is another good resource. There's the 1-800 number, or you can send them an email asking your question. That's the type of person I am. I want to send that email to get that response back in writing so I can put that in the official file folder so that when someone comes out and has a question about something that I've done, then I can show them proof that I was advised to do it this particular way. And naturally, for anything programmatic, you want to make sure that you reach out to your program manager. So with that, that concludes my presentation on pass-through entities' responsibility for subawards. If you have questions, keep in mind my motto: there is no such thing as a dumb question. The answer that I give you may feel that's a dumb answer, but again, my answer is always designed to keep you out of federal prison. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the host of this webinar to see whether or not there are any questions that you have for me.
Hello, yes, we do have some questions for you, Michael. First question, can you explain what a pass-through is?
Okay, pass-through entity is the organization that actually received the award, and I'm trying to stick with OMB's definition of that because the pass-through entity could be the recipient, primary grant recipient, but OMB has came up with the term pass-through. So the pass-through is your entity that applied for the award, but again, you can't do all the work, so you're going to pass down the responsibility for another organization to do that work. So OMB has identified that organization to reduce the different names or terms that they call the prime grantee, the recipient, and they just call it the pass-through entity.
Okay. Next question. Are we required to document this determination for each recipient or contractor relationship we enter?
There is nothing in the uniform guidance where I see that it was a requirement. The thing is you have to have a justification as to why you determine that this organization is a subrecipient and this organization is a contractor. Without that supporting documentation in order to justify what you've done, the federal awarding agency always has that right, that it's easily to overturn that determination if you have no support as to how you came up with the final decision. So again, based on the uniform guidance and even looking at the chart, there's nothing that said that you have to use that in order to make that determination. They're saying that the responsibility is yours. But again, remember what I said in the beginning, that may not dictate how OJP or DOJ is going to look at that relationship, because we're looking at the substance, the amount of work or the type of work that's being performed.
Okay, next question. Was a corrective action plan issued in the absence of structured form/MOA?
One more time, because I'm trying to figure out the relationship of the corrective action plan.
Okay. Was a corrective action plan issued in the absence of a structured form/MOA?
So what's the question? Here's what I think that I'm hearing. If a corrective action plan was submitted and it wasn't submitted on a structured form, is that acceptable? And if that's the question, then yeah, because the key is to resolve those issues. Whatever was left open when the monitor left that needed to be addressed in a corrective action plan, however you send that, if it addresses the issue, then it allows me to close it, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Okay. Will we receive the recording of today's session?
This session will be placed on OJP's website once we do any type of editing or review of it, and a blast email will be sent out to all recipients, giving you the link to where you can find the recording.
Program-based versus operations-based?
What was the question?
That's the question. Program-based versus operations-based. So I'm assuming maybe what is the difference?
And I'm not sure what it's in relationship to, because I'm not sure what a program B is. Since it wasn't a part of my presentation, I would need more information.
Okay. I will follow up with her after.
Okay. Okay.
Can you give an example of a contractor?
An example of a contractor based on the uniform guidance definition is an entity that receives, they use the term award to provide goods and services, okay? So when I think of contractor, I'm always thinking about procurement, okay? Now, don't get me wrong, most people like to use the term contractor individual. So we're talking about one person, whereas, and they use the term consultant also. The key into making what I want to call the appropriate call as it relates to federal funds is look at the work that's being performed. If the contractor is performing an aspect of the federal grant program that was identified in the solicitation and the statutes, then that contractor is not a contractor, but a subrecipient. So again, I've seen multiple definitions of a contractor, but in most cases when we're referring to a contractor, we're always talking about a procurement nature. But again, do that, I'm gonna call it due diligence to make sure that the substance of the work falls in line with property and services.
Okay, next question. Would an MOU or agreement work as written policy and procedures? And then in parentheses, it says regarding slide number 21.
An MOU is a memorandum of understanding. I'm not sure how an agreement between you and the other person could be policy and procedures, if I understood this question correctly. The Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, is the agreement that you're going to do. I need X, Y, Z, and you're telling me, based on this Memorandum of Understanding, how you're going to deliver that. So I don't see that being on the same line as policy and procedures.
Okay. Can you further explain the 10 days in regards to upfronting funds? Is it a requirement or can we modify?
Based on Treasury's guidelines, Treasury says that an organization can do an advance for a few days, okay? So few days could mean, in my definition, 2, okay? The Office of, well, DOJ, let me say the components under DOJ, the grant-making components, so we're talking about what, COPS, OVW, and OJP. We have decided that based on an advance, and since Treasury didn't define a particular time frame, said few days, we meant that, or we decided that that meant 10 days, okay? So if you want to do an advance, and I'm gonna keep it in the format of this particular training. So if you want to give a subrecipient an advance for up to 10 days, because it doesn't have to be up to 10 days. You can set that time frame for something less, but it can't be more than, okay? The deal is that based on the documentation, the subrecipient is showing you that they need this money up front and that it will be out of their door within that 10-day period. And one of the, I guess, the easiest examples to give is that an organization comes in and do a 10-day advance for payroll because they pay every 2 weeks. So in 10 days or less, that money will be out the door. So again, if you're going to allow an organization to do an advance, they need to know up front what your criteria are for that. So yes, it can be something less than 10 days.
Okay, next question. Do you have any recommendations for best practices for monitoring national organizations that do not have a physical office location and staff may be located across the country? Would something similar to an advanced desk review be acceptable?
And I'm leery for saying an advance because an advance can have multiple components or characteristics to it. So depending on your definition of advance, it could be, and again, you're absolutely right. If an organization doesn't have a physical location, there could be something where we're doing a desk review remotely, okay? As a result of the pandemic where we were shut down, that was one of the ways that OJP performed monitoring requirements. We did them remotely through Zooms or other types of platforms where you could see individuals, have that dialogue, and then have them send you the information that you need. So again, remember what I said in reference to the uniform guidance. They do not specify or dictate a particular method for doing monitoring, but the options that they gave was site visit and desk reviews. Would they or could they put in virtual reviews? I guess nobody ever thought that we would get to the position that we were in, but monitoring still had to be done. So that was one way that we were able to make that happen.
Will you need to perform both a physical and programmatic monitoring review for the selected subrecipients?
And yes, if I'm understanding this, physical or financial and programmatic. So when you go on site, you need to be doing both, because how can you understand the financial aspect or how much money they spend if you don't understand the program. Keep in mind, when I come out and do a review, I'm not programmatic inclined. Yes, I've read the solicitation and may have a little background of that particular program office, but I am geared or programmed financially. So if I don't bring a programmatic person with me, then anything that I don't understand programmatically has to be brought back to the agency with me to give to that programmatic person. So if you're in the capability of bringing a financial and a programmatic person on a site visit, yes, it makes it easier. But if you're one or the other, you're not required to have an in-depth understanding of the other side. But you have to have someone within your organization where you can take those issues to and get them resolved to see whether or not there is an issue, if that helps.
Okay, next question. Do you have examples of policies and procedures on how subawards will be made and subrecipients managed?
I don't have a template or a draft policy and procedures on how they should be made. And I'm saying it for this reason, because based on the type of organization, it may be different. I can tell you that some of the things that I use to get an understanding of certain things that you may use too, is sometimes when I want to get an idea of various types of policy and procedures, I'll use this term, I cheat. So I go on Google and put in financial policy and procedures and see what type of information it gives me back. I've been fortunate enough that based on the amount of information that's come back, I've taken information from this particular entity, because you got to remember the type of entity, because I've received policy and procedures for state agencies, for-profit, nonprofit. So again, I may have to pull from those multiple documents to create one that fits my organization.
Okay. Is there a subaward threshold for FFATA reporting?
Yes, there is. Based on the uniform guidance, its update, that amount for reporting requirements for the FFATA reporting has increased from $25,000 to $30,000. That amount is cumulative. I need you to understand that. So here's the thing. If you pass money down to a subrecipient of $20,000, you do not have to report in FFATA on that $20,000 award. But let's just say next year you add supplement money to that award, making it $15,000, making it now $35,000. Now you're bound to report that information in FFATA. So it increased from $25,000 to, as of the release of the updated uniform guidance 11/12/2020, that threshold has increased to $30,000.
Okay, next question. I'm confused on paying subrecipients. Do they have to be paid in advance except under certain circumstances or reimbursed?
I truly apologize that me introducing the advance confused you in reference to paying subrecipients. Subrecipients should be paid based on your agency's policy and procedures for paying them. You are the one that determines how frequently you're going to pay a subrecipient. I know some organizations that pay subrecipients monthly, quarterly. You know, the max that I've ever seen an organization was quarterly, but again, the agency that they were paying quarterly had the working capital to go that amount of time without receiving a reimbursement from the pass-through entity. So again, I want to say that you need to look, first you need to have policy and procedures on how frequently you're going to pay them, every 2 weeks, once a month, and they know that up front, okay? And then if an organization needs to be paid more frequently, then that's dialogue that you need to have with them based on their circumstances or situation, whether or not your agency has the flexibility to pay them outside of your norm. So I mean, I never want to say that, you know, you got to pay them monthly, but again, the idea of paying them, additional information can be found in the prompt pay section of the uniform guidance that I talked about earlier. So again, no, I didn't mean to confuse you. It's just that I know a few, probably can fit on one hand, of organizations that do allow their subrecipients to come in and request in advance.
Can you please go over the 10% rule? Is it 10% of the total federal award that we receive, or is it 10% of the amount of the award that we give to a particular subrecipient?
Okay, 10% represents the movement of money between approved budget categories up to 10%. Has nothing to do with making subawards, nothing. So we make a subaward. And now based on those budget categories, the deal is that I can move money between approved budget categories based on the total amount of the award. So give you an example. Let's just say the total amount of the award, which also includes a portion of that for subrecipients, is $500,000. So based on the 10% rule, I can move $50,000 between approved budget categories without obtaining prior approval. So in other words, if I have 3 budget categories, let's just say salaries, fringe benefits, and travel, I can move up to 10% between those approved budget categories. If I didn't have equipment, I can't put any money in equipment without prior approval. And OJP has a requirement that indirect cost, any money into or out of indirect cost is also a prior approval amount. So if I got $10,000 in indirect cost and I want to move an additional $1,000 in there, I cannot do that without prior approval.
What response time can someone expect if they submit a question through the OCFO email?
And the only reason why I'm hesitating on this is because the OCFO, or I'm imagining that you're talking about ACTS OCFO, that's not in the training division that I'm in, and I'm not sure of their particular time frame. However, if you haven't received a response from them, I'll use this term and say a week, then you want to reach back out to them. But the OCFO ACT OC email address was created to provide you with a response within 48 hours. Okay. So again, depending on the workload, that's why I said a week, but anything over a week, then we need to find out what's going on. We need to reach out again or reach out to someone else.
Could I have a link to more sole source policy and requirements?
Yeah, I think it's the next to the last slide. It's a part of the slide. They have a sole source fact sheet that you can use.
In regards to the 10-day rule for advances, we as the pass-through entity are not allowed to advance more than 10 days of expenses to the subaward.
It appears that something is missing from that question. I'm not sure if you're telling me your policy or you're asking me a question, because what I heard is that based on your agency, you have a policy to not advance more than 10 days. So that's the federal requirement. Well, DOJ's requirement, because again, remember I said Treasury said that you can't advance more than a few days. DOJ defined that to be 10 days. So it sounds like you're saying that based on your state agency, you will allow a subrecipient to do an advance of up to 10 days. Because I didn't hear a question out of that.
Okay, Michael, we are at 3:30. We have about 10 questions left. So please let me know if you would like to continue or if you would like for me to email them to you, and then we can email them out to everyone.
Since we only have 10, keep going.
Okay. Is the sole source justification fact sheet related just award issued under the OJP?
I'm not. One more time. I'm trying to relate the fact sheet to whatever the second part of that was.
Is the sole source justification fact sheet related just award issued under the OJP? Not sure if it's worded.
Huh? I want to say
yes,
no.
That is correct.
Yeah, just awards. I'm not sure what just awards is.
Okay, I will follow up and get a little more information so we can make sure we get her the correct answer.
Okay.
If I issue a sub-award in year 1 of the federal award for $20,000, and then in year 2, I receive supplemental funds on the federal award, with these supplemental funds in year 2, I issue the same organization an additional $20,000 in their sub-award. Since the total sub-award is now greater than $30,000, am I required to report the sub-award amount of $40,000 into FSRS site?
And the answer is yes. Remember, I said that it's cumulative. So in year 1, I'm not required to report. But year 2, since I have met the threshold, and in your question, you've exceeded it, but since I've met the threshold, now I am required to report in FFATA. And once I meet or exceed that threshold, I have until the end of the next month in order to get that information in FFATA. So depending on when the supplement was added, I could have as much as 60 days to give you an example. So let's just say that on October 1st, I make a supplement of that additional $20,000. According to the guidance, I must report that information by the end of the next month. So if I did it on the 1st, that actually gives me 60 days to get it in. But again, once I meet that threshold, I must report by the end of the next month.
Okay. All of our subrecipients are new, and we are requiring them all to submit detailed backup with every invoice. Can this be considered financial monitoring?
No. I mean, and good question. My only thing to you, and I understand they're all new, you're trying to get a feel for the information, okay? Requiring just, all this documentation to justify releasing funds to them. I say it this way. At what point will you run out of space in order to house all of this documentation? So receiving, and again, and let me put it this way, and not trying to be harsh in any way. I can send you whatever that matches, because I'm an accountant, so I'll make the debits equal the credits. I can send you whatever in order for you to release funds to me. But how sure are you that that's accurate information without doing some type of monitoring, whether it's on-site or desk review, okay? So the answer to that would be no. That's not a substitute for monitoring.
Okay. Is it safe to assume that subrecipients are subject to more stringent reporting guidelines?
No, and that's not true. The only reason why I've, in this presentation, used supplemental restrictions or additional requirements is because you, as the pass-through entity, are bound by whatever the subrecipient do. So if things go awry or sideways down at the subrecipient level, I'm not coming to the subrecipient, I'm coming to you in order to resolve that. So some organizations have realized that, and I'll pick on one entity for this example. Some organizations have realized that each year that I give X, Y, Z a sub-award, they're going to push back on something. So how do I get ahead of that? With those award conditions to make sure that, you know, last year you wanted to move 11% between approved budget categories. Can't have that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut you off at 5. So you're under the 10%, so I don't have to worry about chasing you. You're under the 10%. So these are some things that they try to do to lessen the burden on them. So again, I want to say that you're in the best position to determine what type of additional policy and procedures that you may need to put on a subrecipient based on your experience with them over multiple years.
You mentioned that a program came up on your monitoring list. Are programs randomly selected, or does certain activity trigger the need for additional monitoring?
When I talk about programs that we look at monitoring, we do a risk assessment based on some of the things that you saw in this presentation. So when when we're doing the risk assessment, we're looking at dollar amount. One of the dollar amounts is if you have an award from us for $1 million or more, you're in a part of that population. New grantees, you're a part of that population. The inherent risk of a program, what is it? Confidential funds, you know, those are potentially high risk programs. So we place all of them in this program, and based on the information and the amount that we're trying to retrieve from that, it gives us those grants that we are at high risk for. So based on certain things that we look at, let's just say that XYZ was in last year's monitoring pool of documents, and it's also in this year. So if I looked at them last year, I don't want to go back out again next year and look at them again. So I'll move to another grantee that was not selected last year. So again, based on the data that we get from this app that we have, it gives us a range of grantees that we can pull from. So then based on, we have to keep certain things in mind. So based on the amount of staff that we have in order to do this and other things, we tailor that in order to meet the goal and objectives that DOJ has set for how many grantees and the dollar threshold that we have to look at annually.
Next question. Moving money into indirect costs require prior approval. However, if a program needs to move money out of indirect costs to support direct program costs, does that need prior approval?
Yes. According to OJP's requirements for this, any money into or out of indirect costs requires prior approval.
As a pass-through entity, we receive cash requests from our subrecipients, which include invoices for expenses they incurred for grant work. project work. It is a requirement that the subrecipient shows they paid the invoice before we reimburse them for grant funds. Or are we okay to reimburse the subrecipient based on the invoices they submit, which is evidence the expense was incurred by the subrecipient?
Read that again, because it sounds like.
Of course.
As a duplicate.
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
As a pass-through entity, we receive cash requests from our subrecipients, which include invoices for expenses they incurred for their grant project work. It is a requirement that the subrecipient show that they have paid the invoice before we reimburse them for grant funds. Or are we okay to reimburse the subrecipient based on the invoices they submit, which is evidence the expense was incurred by the subrecipient?
And that's what I thought I heard. It sounds like they're saying the same thing, so we might need clarification, because they said that subrecipients will provide them with receipts or invoices for costs that they're claiming. And then he said, is it okay for us to reimburse them based on the invoices that they received? So I'm not sure if that's a true question, or I'm missing something. It seems like they're getting receipts, but then you're asking me, is it okay to get receipts?
Is it okay if they only submit the invoice without the receipts, is what I believe that they're trying to say, but I will reach out as well.
Okay. Now here's the thing. And if that's the case, and you can double check. So if you only receive the invoice without any receipts, my question to you is, what type of, and I'll use this term, risk assessment have you done of that organization to trust their policy and procedures that they have in place and their management system? So again, if that's the case, and you're trying to reduce another level of paper, that's something that you can do, but what's your justification for no longer asking for receipts? Because I give you an example. With the federal government, when I go on travel, there are certain things that the federal government will require me to have a receipt for, but then the federal government also sets a threshold of $75. So if I submit a claim for a $35 taxi fee, I don't need a receipt from the taxi driver, because it's under the federal government's threshold of $75. Okay.
Do we need proof that the invoice was paid?
Yes, because if you don't have proof that it was paid by your organization once, and this has happened, an invoice could be paid twice.
Okay. Next question. If an organization is a subrecipient of a pass-through entity, and that organization / subrecipient has their own individual contractors that provide service on a specific project, as well as others, can the organization / subrecipient continue to claim indirect costs if and when an individual / contractor exceeds $25,000? Or is the individual contractor considered a subcontract and the organization / subrecipient held to the $25,000 threshold on those individuals that reach $25,000?
All right, so here's the thing. So if the pass-through entity, the prime recipient, is passing money down to the subrecipient, and the subrecipient is passing money down to contractors, because that's the term that they're using. They're passing it down to contractors, and the contractors are, and this is what I heard, are implementing an aspect of that particular grant program. You have subrecipients and subrecipients. There can be no work done at the subrecipient level, which you're calling contractors, unless the prime pass-through grantee approves it, because now you're delegating, the subrecipient is now delegating an aspect of the work to the subrecipient, and that cannot happen unless it was approved by the pass-through entity. So here's the thing to keep in mind when you're talking about that 25%, okay? So the subrecipient may have an indirect cost rate too, okay? But again, the pass-through entity cannot claim indirect costs on that sub-award in excess of the $25,000. So that, again, just like the pass-through entity, everything trickles down to the next level. So it's always important to know, because I've seen that too, where the subrecipient says, well, the subrecipient is tasked to do A, B, and C, but they can only do A and B, so they use the term subcontract to another organization to do C. That's a part of the federal grant program, and that makes them a sub-recipient that no work can be done unless the pass-through approves it, because they're delegating a part of their responsibility in that contract to another entity.
Okay. We have an additional 3 questions that came in. Would you like to answer those, or would you like to wrap it up? It's up to you.
Go ahead.
Okay. How many levels of subawards/subrecipients can you have?
I want to put it like this. You don't want to make it too messy, but just in the example that I gave, I've seen where there was the pass-through entity, subrecipient, and then subrecipient that was misclassified as a subcontractor. So again, I'm going to put it like this. In order to keep some type of control over it, you may want to limit it, because if the subrecipient is making a subrecipient, and then the subrecipient is making a subrecipient, that's just too many levels, but they all have to be approved by the pass-through entity. So you want to keep it clean at your level so that you can manage it.
Can you send the questions and answers to us?
Yes. Can't we, Sarah?
Sure.
Mm-hmm. I just have to review them first, that's all.
Who pays travel costs for subrecipient monitoring? The federal award? Should we be building in travel costs for subrecipient monitoring when we apply for an award?
Yes. Again, remember I said the OIG said that one organization said that they didn't have the funds to look at subawards, but if a part of your responsibility is to monitor subawards. So if you don't have the funds, then it needs to come out of the federal grant program. Okay. So yes, that is a cost, an allowable cost that you can factor into the application.
What is the easiest way to determine that a subrecipient is suspended/debarred by the feds?
SAMS.gov has the suspended parties from doing business with the federal government. So go on SAMS.gov, look up the parties excluded from doing business with the federal government, then put in that entity's name. If something comes back, then you know that that entity is suspended or debarred. If nothing comes back, then at this time, that entity isn't suspended or debarred. So one of the requirements on your end is that you have to do that performance or do that check. So if nothing comes back, you want to print that page, put it in your official file folder, because when I ask whether or not you check the suspension and debarment list, you should be able to provide that supporting documentation.
And that is all the questions that we have as of right now.
Okay. I want to say thank you for all of you that hung on for the additional time where we went through these additional questions. I hope that a lot of your questions were answered here. One of the most important things that we try to do is that we tried to gauge the audience to see how well the training had met their goals and objectives. So I'm asking you to do that too. You can either scan this barcode and get the survey, but everybody will get it once you hang up from this particular call, because it will automatically come to your email address. But here's what I truly ask: an honest rating on how well you think that this particular presentation helped you with the topic that was presented. And in addition to that, if you think that there are some other topics that you have an interest in that you would like to see presented on this platform, please take the time to add those as well. So I want to thank you for the time that you allowed me today on behalf of the Office of the Chief Financial Officer and the Chief Financial Officer. We thank you for your time, and we'll see you on another presentation in the future. So thank you.